My name is Seth Hillinger. I'll spell that for the media. It's SETHHILLINGER. And I am a longtime resident of Carroll Gardens. My family that I'm raising here, wife and 2 children, ages 7 and 11, and I are here on behalf of, I am on behalf of myself, members of Voice of Gowanus, and our concerned neighbors in the surrounding community. I am here today to share findings that are extremely disconcerting related to public health and toxic uplands surrounding Gowanus Canal. As a parent, I naturally want to protect the health of my family and the families who live among us in this densely populated coastal borough that we call Brooklyn. The Voice of Gowanus is a local environmental coalition who have been working tirelessly to ensure that Gowanus is safely cleaned up from the deep pockets of pollution left behind by the coal industries of its past. We want to make sure that it is a safe and healthy environment for existing and future residents who will be living here alongside increasingly complicated climate events. Gowanus is a floodplain at sea level with poor infrastructure and deeply polluted land, and that together poses major human and environmental risks. Today, we share with you an environmental database report that we have obtained with the help of Walter Hang, who is here by my left. Without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce Walter, President of Toxics Targeting.
Thank you, Seth. My name is Walter Hang, that's WALTERHANG, and I am the president of Toxics Targeting. We're an environmental database firm, and basically we compile local, state, and federal government information on nearly 1 million toxic sites here in the state of New York. And so I've basically compiled all of the data for the Gowanus Canal, which is behind me, and the area immediately around it. So the Gowanus Canal is on the national priorities list for federal Superfund cleanup, and it is deemed by the state of New York to be a significant threat to public health or the environment, and action is required to clean it up. And so the Environmental Protection Agency is undertaking a $1.5 billion dredging removal action of immense amounts of black mayonnaise, cancer-causing coal tar that's in the bottom of the Gowanus Canal. However, the US EPA has said regarding its cleanup, quote, "The remedy relies on the control of upland sources of contamination to the canal," close quote. And so the bottom line is that EPA has to clean up the canal, but New York State has to clean up dozens and dozens of major toxic sites around the canal, and these are the sources of the pollution that's in the bottom of the canal. And we're going to document today with the government's own data that New York State and Governor Hochul are failing to enforce a key provision of New York State law that requires basically sites to be restored to pre-disposal conditions. And that's essentially NYCRR Part 375-2.8A. And so this makes total sense that if you don't remove all the pollution that's leaking into the canal, after EPA cleans up the canal, it will simply become recontaminated. And that's how come we're calling on Governor Hochul to clean up all of these sites, top to bottom, in strict compliance with all applicable regulatory requirements. So you can see here the Gowanus Canal is a significant threat to the public health or environment. Action is required. This is the government's own data verbatim that Toxics Targeting has compiled. So one of the key sites that is documented is this K Metropolitan Manufactured Gas Plant. So there are 3 major MGP sites that are in this area that are sources of the cancer-causing coal tar that's polluted the Gowanus Canal. And again, you can see, according to New York State, significant threat to the public health or environment, action required. Quote, the site was occupied by a large manufactured gas plant from the late 1800s to the late 1930s. The MGP converted coal and petroleum products to gas, which was used for heating, cooking, and lighting purposes. The process produced large amounts of coal tar waste, which have heavily contaminated the soils beneath the site. And you can see documented, confirmed hazardous waste disposed of. Benzene, that's a known human cancer-causing agent. It impacts the hemopoietic system and causes leukemia. Toluene, naphthalene, benzo-A-pyrene. This is the same chemical in cigarette smoke that causes lung cancer. These are known human cancer-causing agents. And in many cases, the volumes are so huge that we simply don't know how much pollution is there. One of the most infamous sites is the Carroll Gardens Public Place, former MGP site. It's just down that section of the canal. This was used as an MGP site for approximately 100 years. And this has up to 150 feet of coal tar below grade. So this is pollution that's sunk 150 feet. I've been studying toxic sites all over the country for 30 years. I have never heard of this much pollution in one spot. So it's moving horizontally into the canal, but it's also going down. And it can come up in other areas underneath the canal over time. The amazing thing is at this site, the authorities at the state of New York are only going to remove 26 feet approximately of contamination. They're going to leave approximately another 125 feet of pollution in the ground, and basically they've confirmed it pollutes groundwater. The levels are just shockingly high. For example, total benzene, toluene, xylene in groundwater up to 49,400 parts per billion, and the allowable amount I think is 5. So these are just incredible amounts. It's actually like non-aqueous phase liquid, like petroleum, fuel oil, gasoline, just floating on top of the groundwater. And it's also other chemicals like chlorinated solvents that sink down through the groundwater. And again, this cancer-causing coal tar, total cyanide. I mean, it's just an incredible polluted area. And you can see that the sites go all the way down to nearly 2 miles of the Gowanus Canal. So these sites are deemed to be significant threats to the public health or environment, and yet the state of New York is not cleaning them up on a comprehensive basis in any way. And so in addition to people coming in contact with the pollution, they can also breathe the fumes. So time after time, they say volatile organic compounds may move into the soil, vapor, which in turn may move into overlying buildings and affect indoor air quality. This process, which is similar to the movement of radon gas from subsurface into indoor air of buildings, is referred to as soil gas vapor intrusion. So all of these buildings that you see around us are susceptible to cancer-causing agents coming up into the homes and buildings, and yet there's been no comprehensive survey to determine which buildings and homes have been impacted, and there's been no comprehensive effort to make sure that those buildings don't get polluted by sealing off all the cracks and utility conduit openings. So Seth mentioned the problem of flooding. So the bottom line is that the state of New York is allowing huge amounts of toxic pollution to remain in place, and they've driven sheet pile to try to keep the pollution from going into the canal. The problem is, as Seth noted, we're in a floodplain. So if there were a flood, which is an increased risk due to climate change, that light non-aqueous phase liquid contamination would simply come up out of the ground because it's floating on top of the water, and then it would slosh around this densely developed area. So here is the site, Gowanus Village 1. The levels of polychlorinated biphenyl contamination are high under the existing on-site building, and it references light non-aqueous phase liquid. This is polychlorinated biphenyl contamination that's extraordinarily toxic and persistent. So if this floated out of the ground and spread throughout a residential neighborhood, the health hazards would be unprecedented. And there's been no effort to safeguard against that hazard. The final thing I would like to reference is that the state of New York knows that some of these sites have per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and these are the infamous forever chemicals that now have the strictest maximum contaminant level allowed in drinking water. And so they've identified up to 126 parts per trillion, and the allowable amount is only 10. And so in effect, this material constitutes hazardous waste, yet the vast majority of these sites have not been investigated for PFAS. So the bottom line is that the state of New York should restore all of these sites to pre-disposal conditions, and that is not happening so far, and that is why we are here today to send a clear message to Governor Hochul that that law has to be fulfilled. It can and it must be done. So here is a site that's at a manufactured gas plant in Ithaca, New York. You can see there's a big sprung structure, 120 feet long, 60 feet wide. You can see it has carbon filters to purify the toxics out of the air. You can see that they drove sheet pile 53 feet below grade, and they're using giant excavators both inside that giant tent and outside, and they're removing all of the pollution for an entire city block. And so this is the remediated site. All of the toxic soil was removed down to a competent clay layer. There are new streets, there are new utilities, and all these homes have been safeguarded. That's what has to happen here at the Gowanus Canal at all these sites. Otherwise, these sites will continue to threaten public health for years to come, and it will ultimately leak back into the canal, where it will re-pollute the area that EPA has remediated. So it's my understanding that the cleanup has proceeded as far as this bridge. And if you go on the other side of the bridge and look down, you can see toxics leaking into the Gowanus Canal plain as day.
Thank you so much, Walter. I would now like to introduce Margaret, a 20-year
More than that.
more than 20-year resident.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Margaret Maugenet, Margaret, Maugenest, community resident. My name is Margaret Maugenet, and I'm a cancer survivor. I moved into the Gowanus Canal area in 1984. Gowanus was zoned industrial then, but I was able to live as an artist in residence in a building with other artists. We all endured noxious odors and fumes in the immediate neighborhood virtually every day. About 10 years after moving into my building, my neighbors and I ordered an environmental database report from toxics targeting. Walter Hang called me up and told me about the building's proximity to a former manufactured gas plant that contains many cancer-causing toxins, including coal tar that can migrate through the environment. This is the former Fulton MGP site, now the Thomas Green Park, located diagonally across the street from my home. In 2019, I was diagnosed with colon cancer. I always believed being exposed to cancer-causing pollution likely made me sick, since there is no history of cancer in my family history. I'm lucky to have survived surgery, but no one should have to go through what I have experienced with cancer. Moreover, there have been other cases of cancer in my building. That is why I strongly support and am a signatory to the Voice of Gowanus coalition letter, which requests that Governor Hochul immediately require the Fulton MGP site and all other toxic sites that pollute the Gowanus Canal to be comprehensively remediated and restored to pre-disposal conditions. I believe this is the only way to safeguard public health in my community. I believe it would be irresponsible for state authorities to allow thousands of residents of the Gowanus Canal to live next to immense quantities of cancer-causing coal tar. That is simply unthinkable. Thank you. Hear, hear.
Next, I'll invite Georgia Parks to come share a statement.
My name is Georgia Parks, Georgia like the state, P-A-R-K-S. I have lived across the street from the community citizen site for over 40 years. But I'm speaking today as a registered nurse with over 50 years experience in caring for the people of this community, both at the Long Island College Hospital and currently I'm an oncology RN at a large chemo infusion center not too far away. I've seen the evolution of cancer science in recognizing the dangerous role of toxic environmental pollutants in the development of many types of cancers. Chief among that is the known connection between the exposure to benzene and other volatile compounds with the blood and bone marrow cancers, specifically the acute leukemias. This is the legacy of what has been left behind in our community at multiple sites along the canal. I'm extremely concerned about the enormous amounts of this and other cancer-causing agents left behind in this neighborhood. No amount of coal tar and no amount of volatile organic compounds is safe in our homes and schools. To sink the foundation of these planned high-rises into this contaminated and inadequately remediated soil is to provide a direct conduit for these poisonous chemicals to come through the smallest cracks and gaps of these structures. And it is no exaggeration to say that I really am horrified that they were planning on erecting a school on the site as well. Is this really worth the risk? We cannot allow this to happen. And this is why I'm one of the signatories of the Voice of Gowanus coalition letters that is requesting Governor Hochul to fully remediate dozens of highly toxic sites to the pre-disposal conditions in order to safeguard public health and the environment around the Gowanus Canal. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Georgia. So today we are introducing a coalition letter directed towards Governor Hochul, releasing this shocking toxic site data. New York State has failed to remediate more than 3 dozen sites that threaten our public health. In this letter, we write her respectfully to request that she remediate all inactive hazardous waste disposal sites, brownfields, hazardous substance releases, and other documented contamination threats to the Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn, New York, in strict compliance with state mandates requiring comprehensive toxic cleanups to pre-disposal conditions and pollution spill source removal in order to fulfill all applicable regulatory requirements. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to note that coalition letter is a web form. It's posted on the Voice of Gowanus website. And so this allows people to sign up, and then those letters will be forwarded to the governor on a going forward basis. And the Gowanus Canal is now the line of defense for public health in the state of New York. And if we can't get Governor Hochul to clean up these contaminated sites, which are just vastly exceeding applicable regulatory requirements, then communities all over the state are going to basically not be protected from hazards similarly. So that's how come I've come down to the Gowanus Canal. This is where the fight is going to be waged, and this is where we're going to hold the governor accountable for making sure that public health is protected and the Gowanus Canal doesn't get recontaminated. That would be an unforgivable and irresponsible exercise in futility. So I'm so proud and happy to see so many people here gathered to basically sign this letter and to send that clear message to the governor. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, we'll try to answer them.
How many sites are we talking here? I know you said more than 3 dozen, but do you have an exact number?
Yeah, these are basically 38 sites. And so I went through literally thousands of documented spills, brownfields, inactive sites. And these were the ones that I selected are the most egregious cases of contamination. Again, up to 150 feet deep, cancer-causing coal tar. The levels are documented to vastly exceed state cleanup requirements, and they're all posted on Voice of Gowanus' website.
They're not all brownfields sites, right?
Correct. So brownfields are basically sites where there are tax incentives to remediate the contamination. The problem is that the state of New York doesn't enforce the regulatory requirements. Many of these are also sites that are included in the inactive hazardous waste disposal site registry, and they are Class 2 sites that are deemed to be significant threats to the public health and the environment. But the regulatory exceedances, you can see from the site profiles that are posted at their website, they're just no ifs, ands, or buts, vastly above the allowable amounts. It's just that the state of New York is not enforcing cleanup requirements. I mean, to a degree that's shocking. And I think that citizens all across the state are going to basically say, if the Gowanus Canal is being protected from these enormously high levels of pollution, what about Long Island groundwater? What about upstate areas? And so this is really an issue that has come to light really for the first time, that enforcement is so incredibly lax, and that pre-disposal condition restoration requirement has to be fulfilled. Otherwise, if the law isn't being enforced, the law doesn't really exist.
So just to be clear, all of these sites that you're talking about are being remediated. They're just not going far enough with the remediation.
Many of these sites are not being remediated at all. I mean, some of these are being mitigated, and where there is some effort being made to drive sheet pile, for example, to keep the pollution from going directly into the canal, as has been documented for decades. The problem with driving a sheet pile is it doesn't stop the pollution from finding alternative routes. And you can see from the profiles, this pollution is going down, down, down. So it will ultimately come up into adjoining areas. Some of these profiles that I posted, they actually report that tar balls are coming out of the ground where people are walking around. And again, this is not in any way solving the problem of the soil gas vapor intrusion. So for example, in Endicott, New York, where IBM had a giant solvent spill, 500 homes have actually been equipped with these sub-slab depressurization systems to keep the pollution out. Just walking around here this morning, I didn't see a single sub-slab depressurization system. And in public place, they're doing pump and treat to try to keep the coal tar and contamination from going into the Gowanus Canal. That is just antiquated. I haven't seen a pump and treat system being proposed for decades because they don't work. So for example, on Onondaga Lake, which was once considered one of the most toxic waterways in the country, they built a 1.5 mile long French tile drain system where the pollution would drip down into a big void and then get diverted to a treatment system. I don't see any of that here. So again, leaving the pollution in place makes no sense at all. It's all got to be removed. That's what the law requires. Source removal.
Aside from the specific Superfund site, these locations are under the supervision of the state, right? The DEC?
Correct. These are all New York State Department of Environmental Conservation sites. So the EPA is cleaning up the Gowanus Canal, but the adjoining upland sites are the responsibility of the state of New York, and EPA has said if those upland sites don't get controlled, then their remedy of dredging the canal will fail. And right across this bridge, you can see that failure in process. You can see the sheen going into the canal in the area that has already been dredged. That's just a visual confirmation of all the concerns that we're documenting. Unless all these sites get properly cleaned up in strict compliance with the law, they're simply going to remain polluted, and when a flood comes along, that light non-aqueous phase liquid is going to be coming out of the ground and spreading throughout this densely developed neighborhood. There's no dispute about that.
You were talking about one site that was, I think, 150 feet deep where the contamination was. Is that the case at a majority of these sites, or was that the extreme scenario?
No, I mean, the site where Margaret is, I think, is 120 feet deep. There's another site that's 46 feet deep, 100 feet deep. I mean, this is what's called dense non-aqueous phase liquid. So it's like I threw a rock into the canal. The rock would sink. So these very, very high levels of pollution are denser than water. For example, I noted extensive contamination with trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene. These are chlorinated solvents, are very toxic, very persistent, and they are sinking down, down, down. But even if they're in the ground, whether it's high or low, that pollution wants to get to the atmosphere. And if it comes up underneath a hole, a building, a school, a place of worship, it can come in just like radon. That is documented for, again, dozens of these sites, and yet the public has not been protected from that hazard.
Has Voice of Gowanus or your group reached out to the state or the governor's office before this and expressed these concerns, and if so, what has been the response?
Yes, so has the EPA.
No.
And so has the EPA Gowanus CAG.
And so has other groups, including the EPA and Gowanus CAG. And you interviewed one of our state assemblywomen. We've tried to get their attention, and the only thing that worked, unfortunately, was when the kids reported it. The kids at the playground smelled it and knew that something wasn't right. So we are going straight to the top. This is Governor Hochul's decision, and it's up to her whether she wants to enforce the laws or let people get sick. It's as simple as that.
You know, when I got out of the subway to come here this morning, I saw that I was, I think, on Eileen Dugan Boulevard. And so Eileen Dugan was a wonderful assembly rep who was chair of the Economic Development Subcommittee. And decades ago, she provided funding for a local group and I met these wonderful Italian women, and they loved the Gowanus Canal. They called it the Venice of Brooklyn. And of all the sites that they picked to try to redevelop the area for housing, they picked Public Place. And so I could tell that the site was polluted, but they had beautiful renderings, and they had this young architect, and they wanted so much to protect the Gowanus Canal. And so the problem is that no one understood how extensive the pollution problems were. So the state of New York has known about this literally for decades, but I think that this is a new beginning of a citizen campaign that combines using the government's own data to document the concerns about threats to public health and flooding hazards due to climate change, and to hold the governor accountable in a way that I think is irrefutable because it's the government's own data. And we have absolutely clear-cut examples, and I showed these pictures to the DEC Commissioner, Pete Gowanus, and I never will forget. He looked past me at Dale Denoyers, the head of site remediation, and he said, "Are we doing this anywhere else in the state of New York?" And Dale said, "No, but we would like to." And so I believe the time has come for the state of New York to enforce the law. And I think that this is the most egregious example of what happens when the law isn't enforced. The pollution continues to pose a threat to public health. And if heaven forbid there's a giant flood here, this is going to be an incomparable and unprecedented disaster. So the governor is going to be alerted to all these concerns, and I'm sure these people are going to start phone banking and let her know how concerned they are and how much they want her to fulfill their very respectful written request that's fully documented.
Point out to everybody where we're standing right now during Hurricane Sandy, we would be standing in 4 feet of water. That's how much the flood came and was before.
One of our members pointed out that during Hurricane Sandy, we would now be standing in 4 feet of water. It's funny that they like to compare this to the Venice of Brooklyn, because have you been to Venice? It's sinking. We know that the floods are coming. We know that sea levels by 2055, that's not too long from now, 30 years from now, will be 2 feet higher. And during superstorms, they could be 10 times that. 20-foot floods in this area, we know are coming. And that's just 30 years from now. When we're talking about building, I live in a building that's over 100 years old. We must be thinking about the future on those levels, not these short-term fixes that ultimately will have grave effects.
On a final note, with regard to Superstorm Sandy, toxics targeting just compiles the government's own data. Local, state, and federal information is what we use to document these concerns and map these sites. But after Superstorm Sandy, my firm was interested to see that there were thousands of uncontrolled petroleum releases where fuel oil tanks floated away, they broke away from the piping, the petroleum spewed out, and those spills were never cleaned up in the vast majority of cases. So these are real concerns. They're in the government's own data. We're simply asking that the law be strictly enforced. Thank you all very much for coming here today. If you have additional questions, we'll try to answer.
Thank you. Please sign our coalition letter. Everyone listening, watching, thank you for joining us today.